There's a lot of space out there, and it's ready to be invaded. Or something to that extent. This is Space Invaders, released in 1990 exclusively in Japan for the original Game Boy. And right off the bat, you're hearing that, you're probably thinking, hey, that doesn't sound right. Well, technically, in this case, it is true that we never got this Space Invaders game on Game Boy. Those who get my drift probably know where I'm going here, but for the rest of you, let's dive into the game before your head starts to hurt. So I'm assuming you're all familiar with Space Invaders. Vintage 1977 title arcade classic where you have to clear away the wave of descending invaders before they touch the floor and end your game. You've got 4 shield bunker things to hide behind for cover from enemy fire, which slowly deteriorate over time and abuse. The more invaders you shoot down, the quicker the remaining ones move. UFOs pop up every so often that you can kill for bonus points. Pretty much your usual brand of classic Space Invaders action from back in the day, all properly adapted to this tiny Game Boy game pack. That is all there is to it. No frills, no gimmicks, no fancy stuff, just vintage, old-school Space Invaders at its most basic, slow-paced methodicalness on display here. And for what it is a perfectly functional and quite well-made port of the arcade classic. It controls quite nicely, which shouldn't be too much of a surprise given its quaint simplicity. It certainly sounds the part, even with the somewhat crude Game Boy sound processing. And while the inverted color scheme of dark objects over white void is a technical change that might annoy some purists of these things, you can at least make out all the different invader types, even in this shrunken down format. And there's also a 2-player mode via Game Link. There's not much else to say about this one. It's Space Invaders on Game Boy, and quite a solid port of the game by 1990 Game Boy standards, and this never left Japan for reasons unknown, but that's okay because 4 years later, the rest of the world will get this Space Invaders cartridge, and this is the one most of you are probably thinking of. Released in 1994 and retooled with added functionality for the then newly released Super Game Boy adapter for Super Nintendo, which not only gave the game a new border and also different color palettes, but there was even a fully functional SNES iteration of the game that you could play from the device. This particular Space Invaders cart was already the subject of a previous video long ago, but long story short, it's one of the more impressive showcases of the Super Game Boy hardware despite being a somewhat simplistic yet solid port of an ancient arcade game. And it's that showcase of what the Super Game Boy could do, as well as a unique piece of coding allowing for a full-blown SNES game to be played from a meager Game Boy cart, even if this is just another version of Space Invaders, that proves to be this version's biggest selling point. As for the plain Jane Game Boy title, Space Invaders 94 does see some minor touch-ups and updates over the original 90 release. An arcade-accurate font, almost arcade-accurate sound effects, and new title screen. Still got the inverted colors, but if you're playing this on any Game Boy device that isn't a Pocket or original, it'll look more the part with its default palette. Beyond that, it's the same Space Invaders game you played before, but slightly retooled to work with Nintendo's newest toy at the time. Even with that out of the equation, when it comes to Space Invaders on Game Boy, this 94 edition is the one to get, which is funny because this version never got a release in Japan because they already had a Game Boy version to call their own, and it's the same game as always, but definitely a relic of a different time. All in all, the Japanese release of Space Invaders on Game Boy from 1990 is there for those who are into completing their collections or just random curiosities of sorts, but there's a better version of Space Invaders on Game Boy that's arguably easier to get these days, so yeah, whatever. Bye!